Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now today I am in London and I'm on the hunt to look and find statues of foreign leaders, statues of significant leaders from faraway lands who are memorialised here in London. Now I've made a video before about US presidents, so I'm not including any of them. Plus we talk a lot about America, don't we? I want to find out about some countries we don't often associate ourselves with. This is the Norwegian Church in Rotherhithe, and I'm here specifically by the bust of King Håkon VII, the famous King of Norway during the Second World War. And he's an extraordinary figure, actually, amazing history. First and foremost, he wasn't actually Norwegian. He was Danish, the son of the King of Denmark, and he was elected to be King of Norway. Interesting story. In the year 1905, for 100 years preceding that, Norway had been in an alliance or a union either with Sweden or with Denmark. In 1905, they become independent from them. Suddenly, they are no longer tied to those countries, so it needs a new king. And what better way to do that than to democratically elect it in a referendum, and King Håkon wins that election. So amazing, a legitimate democratic monarch, quite a rare thing in Europe or anywhere else. Now, his biggest impact is felt during the Second World War, because when the Nazis invade in 1940, he refuses to abdicate. He says, absolutely not. I can in no way associate myself with this regime. So they push him out and they point to the chap Quisling, which obviously now is a word that's associated with traitors. They point him to be the Prime Minister. Håkon has to leave, and he comes here to London, hence why his statue or his bust is here. He makes speeches to the Norwegian people, and he always says, you must show resistance. No way should you comply with the Nazi regime. We are going to stand up for the democratic principles which elected him. And eventually, when the Nazis leave and the World War ends, 1945, he carries on being king in 1957 with that legitimacy of resistance, of protecting democratic values. So a real extraordinary figure here, and celebrated by the Norwegian Church. This is Parliament Square, and of course there's a pantheon of statues here to many foreign leaders, but the one I really have to focus on is, of course, Nelson Mandela, the leader of the fight against apartheid and president of South Africa. Now, how can I really summarise the life of Nelson Mandela? Far too big. Obviously you should read Long Walk to Freedom, but essentially he came to fame by leading the youth wing of the ANC, the African National Congress, and indeed it formed into the armed wing, the Umkhonto we Sizwe. And he would sabotage equipment and essentially lead a terrorist campaign. This made he was arrested in 1962, and in 1964 a very significant trial, the Rivonia trial, took place, where he was a trained lawyer. His articulation of his cause and his defence made headlines around the world. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his impact had already begun. He then spent the next 27 years in prison, primarily on Robben Island, an island just off Cape Town, in harsh conditions. He became a symbol of oppression, a symbol of freedom, a symbol of fighting for rights. Eventually, in 1990, he was released. And in 1994, he spearheaded the first multiracial elections in South Africa, and he was elected president of South Africa in 1994. And he led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whereby people who have been oppressed, often members of the black community who have been oppressed by people who have been working for the apartheid regime, they met together and they got the truth out and sorted out. It was a healing process that he led South Africa through. I'm at Carlton Gardens, just off St James's Park in the centre of London, and behind me is a statue of one of the most significant figures in French 20th century history, Charles de Gaulle. He had an extraordinary career as a leader. Let's start first of all as a wartime leader, and that's why he's here in Carlton Gardens. He was actually at the start of the Second World War, he was a relatively unknown sort of figure, relatively high up in the French army. He fought back the German Blitzkrieg campaign and tried to resist it as much as he can, especially in May 1940. Alas, it wasn't enough, and of course the Germans managed to push through into Paris, and the government of Marshal Pétain surrendered to the Germans and set up the Vichy government. But Charles de Gaulle said, "Bof, I'm not doing this," and so he fled to London, specifically to this building here on Carlton Gardens, and he set up the Free French Forces, or essentially the French government in exile. And indeed all the Allies recognised France's government was based from that building in London, and Charles de Gaulle as the head of that. And indeed he made a famous speech in that building to radio. I think it was on June the 18th of 1940, essentially to the French people saying, resist the German occupation, keep French dignity high, do not ever go ahead with the Germans. And this essentially created the French resistance movement. And during the Second World War, de Gaulle did a lot to organise the French resistance movement, organise French opposition to Germany, which was integral when it came to the D-Day landings. Fast forward to 1958 and he comes back again. By the end of the 1950s, France was in a bad situation. It had lost essentially its Vietnamese colonies, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The war in Algeria was extremely bad. French colonialism was collapsing. The idea of French identity was again at its knees. So here he comes to the rescue. And one of the first things he says was, we need constitutional change. We need to put much more power in the executive, in the presidency. Ooh, that just so happens to me. And he creates the Fifth Republic, which is the system we still have today in France. So what sort of president was he? Well, he had interesting foreign policy, trying to prop up colonialism again. He famously withdrew France from NATO because of his fear of American influence and American power. With that, he created France's own nuclear weapon system. He wanted to make sure that France was essentially separate from America in terms of its nuclear powers and in terms of its nuclear weapons. And of course, famously, he said no twice to Britain trying to join the European Union. Much to Britain's chagrin, I think. Again, I think he was worried about America's influence over Europe and France. Rather extraordinary, his anti-Americanism, considering America helped liberate France during the Second World War, but there we go. But actually his social reforms were very conservative, very oppressive and quite aggressive. And indeed, young people in France were particularly associated de Gaulle with oppression. And actually May 1968, 10 years into his presidency, there were huge riots within France. Really quite dangerous times for de Gaulle, and by the end I think he was old and tired and he decided to give up. This is Portland Place in the centre of London, and just by the Polish embassy here is a statue of a true hero of Poland, Władysław Sikorski. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. Now, he was a tremendous figure. He is very similar to both de Gaulle and King Haakon in that he led his government, his country, in exile during World War II, which had been invaded. But actually his significance and historical importance lies before that, because in an interesting time, Poland, before First World War, was actually consumed under three big empires: the Russian Empire, the Prussian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian. After the First World War, they're suddenly free. A new nation is formed. But very quickly they get invaded again, this time by the newly formed Soviet Union, just after the Russian Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. And this time Poland says no, absolutely not. And Sikorski was the head of the armed forces, and he became a great wartime hero. And indeed, in the Miracle on the Vistula, 1920 Battle of Warsaw, they managed to fight off the forces of the new Soviet Union, defend the new Polish state, and he became the great hero of it. And indeed he goes on to be Prime Minister of Poland briefly in the 1920s, and he forms the modern state of Poland, makes alliances with Britain and France, hence why they become government in exile here again. Fast forward to World War II, and he's once again leading his country, but this time not in Poland, from London. And he actually again becomes this great symbol of, like de Gaulle and Haakon, of independence, standing up against oppression. But his oppression, his problem is not necessarily just with Nazi Germany, it is also with the Soviet Union and Stalin, and this becomes a bit awkward for the British. And indeed 1943 is a bad time because there is a massacre, the Katyn massacre, where Soviet troops kill thousands of Polish young men who were troops, soldiers, and so it's like a bit on which side we are. So Sikorski really goes against the Soviets, against the Russians. This is a bit awkward because Britain is nominally in an alliance with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. Things get more and more controversial on the 4th of July 1943 because Sikorski dies in a plane crash. His plane had taken off from Gibraltar and it crashes. The official investigation is mechanical failure, but conspiracy theories and other ideas loom. The reason for those conspiracy theories is that Sikorski was pushing very hard for there to be an investigation into the Katyn massacre. So, was it just a mistake, or was it just an accident? Probably. But could it have been the Soviets trying to push this man away? Could it be the British trying to get rid of this embarrassment? We, of course, have no idea. And I'm not usually a big fan of conspiracy theories anyway, but interesting person nonetheless. A great symbol of Polish nationalism, identity and independence here in the centre of London. I'm in Bayswater, and behind me is a bust of a medieval Albanian military leader. Yes, a little bit niche, but he was actually a very interesting figure, George Skanderberg. He was born in 1405, as it says there, but interestingly, at the age of 20, he was taken hostage by the Ottoman Empire, by the Sultan in Istanbul, or as it was then, Constantinople. And now for 20 years, he served that Sultan very loyally. He fought for the Ottoman Empire and changed his name to Iskender, which eventually turned into Skanderberg. But suddenly in 1443, he switched back to being Albanian again and fought for the Albanian nationalism against the marauding Ottomans. And he converted significantly back to Christianity, having been forced to convert into Islam. He unified all the princes of Albania together to form a strong bloc. And for 20 years, in the middle of the 15th century, Albania was able to resist Ottoman expansion, which was going all the way into the Balkans, so quite significant. He's called there on this plinth invincible. I think that's part of his prowess as a military commander. Apparently he was really good at sieges. He would be able to hold out for months on end in the sort of small mountain villages of Albania. Very ruthless man. And the other thing he's described there is a defender of Western civilization. That might be a bit strong. It might be better to call it a defender of Christian civilization. And he saw that as his mission, defending Christianity against, of course, Islam from the Ottoman Empire. He wasn't really rewarded back there with support from the papacy. I think they gave a bit of lip service to say, yes, that's great, but they never supplied him with troops, or other European powers, Christian powers, didn't supply him with help. Sadly, his legacy didn't really live on in that sense. Once he died, the Ottomans were able to come in, the Albanian princes couldn't resist, and Albania turned into a province of the Ottoman Empire and converted into Islam. So his legacy was a bit lost there. But he is a hero, a national hero in Albania still today. This still all begs the question, why is he here in Bayswater? And nobody really knows. There was a festival for sculpture in 2012, and that happened to be the 100th anniversary of the formation of the modern state of Albania, so they pushed this forward. But why Bayswater? No connection, no Albanian embassy or whatever. And why London? I mean, yes, okay, significant person and an Albanian national hero, but still all a bit random. Don't quite know what the purpose is. But maybe we can give the purpose and we can end this story here. In my tour of all the various different statues of different foreign leaders, I've had a wonderful time. It's been really interesting to find out people from different places, from like Albania and Norway, etc. And also find out people who haven't got a connection to London really at all, like George Skanderberg and others. As always, let me know. There's others out there I could do, and so I could do another one of these. But please leave any comments you feel free. Please don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.